Hi, everybody. David Meilan here, Director of Investor Relations with Nighthawk Equity. One of the things that I want to talk about today is the behavior of the millennial generation. Today, we have Drew Kniffin as our guest. Drew, who exactly are the millennials and why do they matter so much?
Yeah, good question, David. So the millennials are defined as people born between 1981 and 1996. They're an important group because unlike previous generations, they grew up with computers, they grew up with technology, they grew up with smartphones in their hands. And so they're connected. They're connected digitally to others. And this connection changes the way they behave. And we've seen in the data that millennials are behaving differently than other generations in meaningfully significant ways, right? So they're changing the way that we're going to talk about this, but the way that they buy homes, the way they look at raising families. And we need to watch that as investors in order to make intelligent decisions about what the future holds.
Yeah, Drew, millennials today are at the oldest, nearly 40 years old, and at the youngest, about 21. So in terms of data, what do we know about millennials today regarding, how they buy homes versus how they rent and where they live?
Yeah, this generation has been behind on home ownership historically. So when you look back at the data, they've trailed the previous generations on home ownership. And while they're making up some of the gap, they continue to lag those prior generations. So here are some numbers. At age 30, 42% of millennials own homes, compared to Gen X, the previous generation, was at 48%. And 51% of the two generations back, baby boomers, owned homes at that age. So what we're seeing is over the years, at the same age, different generations are less and less likely to own homes.
Wow, those are some huge numbers. And we know there's a ton of millennials out there. And so when you apply those percentages across 72 million of them, that's about 4 million homes that should be owned by millennials compared to Generation X behavior, but it's not. And so that leads to the question, what are they doing instead?
Well, there's only two options, right? You either own a home or you rent your home. And so they're renting their homes. And it's fair to assume that most of those who are doing rentals are renting apartments. Right. And my data here, this 72 million millennials is not coming from some bias source. It's coming from the Census Bureau. So this is data coming from people who do demographics and do data for a living, giving us this information. And it's a big change.
Yeah, big change indeed. So Drew, any insight as to why this is happening?
Yeah, the why component is a little bit tougher, right? We can say that this is what the data says, but why is it happening? You get a little bit more into theories. There's a couple theories that I think make sense. So first, there's an economic argument. Millennials they had their economic worldviews informed right around the 2008, 2009, 2010 housing crash. And so their mindset seeing that was this housing thing is a giant gamble. It's a casino. It can go up, it can go down. And do I really want to put a huge percentage of my net worth into that asset class? And their answer is no, I don't want to. I don't want to risk it. And then the second part is more of a lifestyle decision. I think millennials also, this goes back to being connected. They have more of a desire to be free, to not be tied down, to not be anchored down. And so they don't want to have a home that is going to really drive their lifestyle decisions. They're going to want to be free to move. Let's say they want to move from New York to Houston, and they can do that very easily. It's expensive to sell a home. And it basically costs nothing to end a lease. So I think there's this mental component also that's driving the decreased home ownership in the millennials.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that leads me to kind of the big question here, the question that, pretty much everyone who's viewing this wants to know. What does all this mean for apartment building investors?
Yeah, it means that there are millions more people who, for whatever reason, whether it's lifestyle or economics, are choosing not to be the owners of their home. And if they're not going to own their home, someone has to fill that gap. Someone has to save the capital, spend the capital, put it to work, buy the asset, continually put money into the capital expenditures on that asset, and get a fair return on their capital for doing that. And ultimately, that's going to be us. That's going to be the apartment building investors. So what it means, I think, is there is a strong long-term demographic trend toward more renters, more demand for rental units. And that's something that we as apartment building investors can take advantage of. There's 72 million of these millennials, and their behavior says, we're going to be renting our housing, not owning them. And so that's where we come in. We're going to provide that housing for them, and we can reap those returns.
Drew mentioned this is the perfect time to start taking advantage of this situation here. For the audience out there, if you guys are interested in taking advantage, please schedule a call with me if you haven't. I'd love to spend some time going through the benefits of apartment building investing and why this is the perfect time to do so. You can always schedule a call by visiting our website. It's nighthawkequity.com/join and scheduling a call from there. Beyond that, thanks so much for joining this podcast today. And, we'll see you next time.